Speakeasy. This story takes place in a futuristic America with a 1920s aesthetic. The government suppresses all speech, and being critical of them results in swift punishment. There are illegal speakeasies where some gather to plot revolution or simply speak without being heard by government surveillance. "That fool ought to choke on his own tongue," Walter grunted, scraping the end of his cigarette against the ashtray. He could see Carla roll her eyes from across the bar. "That's just what I heard him say yesterday." She started to pour a drink, her red-patterned blouse moving with her. "Don't be condemning a man on hearsay." The dim lights played off the liquid swirling in Walter's glass as he took a swig. "That Dave Whitmore best hope it's just hearsay," he said, placing the cup back on the counter. "He knows what comes to loose-lipped idiots that speak out of turn outside." Carla leaned against the counter, her bright red lips pursed in thought. "You know, I haven't seen him recently." She reached under the counter, sliding her hand blindly across the underside of the bar top. "This is where he said he was going last time I saw him." She held out a small piece of paper that had been stuck under the bar with an address scrawled messily in smeared pen. Walter reached across, grasping it quicker than he intended. He unfurled the crinkled edges, memorizing the contents. "Be back later," he grunted without lifting his head from the paper and without waiting for Carla to respond. She gave a half-hearted wave and a good luck before she went back to work cleaning glasses and rearranging bottles. The sharp slam of the car door echoed into the air, two boots planted into the mud. He reached into his coat pocket, finding a small slip of paper, torn at one edge. 55 Walnut Drive. Walter surveyed his new surroundings. Not a person in sight, just a vast emptiness clutching the tree line. He started walking past his car and into the dense woods. His pale eyes roamed the brush, searching for any movement as he wandered. The first thing he noticed was not the posters strung tree to tree, but the silence. The emptiness lingering in the fullness of the summer leaves that howled louder than any sound. Walter looked up, to the branches laden with feathered songbirds, mute and still, like taxidermy. Life turned into a thing, an object void of any thought. The birds, dull in expression, stared right at him, a gaze fixed by a dozen of deep black marbles. It took him but a moment to realize there was no tree void of the creatures. Pine to pine, they watched him without movement. He too went still. He had halted under one of the posters, ink worn from rain. Its familiar image portrayed a faded security camera. It is a poster typically seen within the city, where people would see them, not the outlands. But a dozen of them lie strewn across the forest under the silent chorus of birds. The birds are their inky eyes that bore down on him. The birds. It hit him all at once, the posters, the birds, still as death. Walter broke his own stillness, heading back as he came in a frantic rush. He didn't stop running until he felt the hard steel of the car door slam. Walter slammed his fist against the console. Cameras, of course. Why would they ever leave anywhere unmonitored, he growled. Glancing to his right, he could see a brooding raven perched at the top of a pine. It was looking right at him through the car window. Its plastic features sent a chill down his spine. He took a moment to collect himself before slowly accelerating down the vacant road. He felt the gas pedal give under the force of his boot, rasping his fingers on the wheel. Then there was a sound, a thud from the back seat. Before Walter could turn his head, he could see arms reaching over, gripping the edge of the front seat. He slammed on the brakes, whirling around to confront the invader. "Who in the—" He paused, scanning the fumbling mess, now pulling himself into the passenger seat. "Dave?" Dave sat upright, squirming into the seatbelt. He said nothing. His gray eyes, like clouds before a storm, he looked at Walter. A look that was too long for a glance, but not quite a stare either. Then he nodded at the road. Walter started to drive once again, occasionally looking over at Dave. His eyes were fixed on the road, not once turning to Walter. "What were you doing out here?" Walter asked, his tone void of his previous frustration. Dave said nothing. He didn't even move. Walter silently wondered if he was even still breathing. He didn't try to say anything else. He just kept his eyes forward. The drive wasn't far, but it felt twice as long as it should be. The evening began to come into view, stretching shadows tall and thin in the purple hue. "Speed up," Dave finally said. His voice was hoarse and vacant, like he wasn't used to speaking. Walter jumped at the sudden presence of sound. "Right," he replied, pushing down on the pedal. 20 minutes of silence passed between the two, before Walter pulled the car into the familiar parking garage. The two got out, then walked to the elevator. Dave looked at him. "They were listening to us," he said. punching in the combination of numbers in the elevator. Figured as much. Walter leaned against the wall of the elevator, watching as the doors clamped shut. Yeah, you seemed freaked out, he laughed. No, I wasn't, he growled. Hey, how'd you get in my car anyway? Dave smiled. Come on, Walt. We didn't get this far without learning a thing or two about sneaking around. Well, you're getting too good at it, he smirked. Although I wish you didn't have to be, he thought. If only things were different. The iron doors pulled apart, revealing the familiar saloon. Carla looked over, waving. Hey, boys, she called. The two wandered over to the counter, each taking a seat on the other side of the bar. Carla leaned in. So tell me, what happened? She asked. Dave hesitated for a second, most likely still getting used to speaking freely. Well, I may or may not have lost my temper and said something unkind. He met Walter's unimpressed gaze. And where were you when that unkind thing was said? Walter asked, brow raised. Dave let his eyes drift off to the far end of the counter. In the city, where there was a slight possibility a surveillance agent heard me. He gave a nervous smile. Walter sighed. Well, what happened after? He asked, scratching his chin. You were gone for quite a while. I knew they were on to me. I was hearing an extra set of steps as I walked. Shadows seemed to loom taller, and I just knew something didn't feel right, Dave said as he leaned back in his chair. So I had to lay low for a while. So you went to the Outer Lands? Walter asked. Well, not exactly. You see, I didn't realize those areas were now being surveyed. All those birds, not to mention the posters every 10 feet. Dave leaned forward, taking a sip from the glass Carla put in front of them. It was like someone was trying to leave us a message with the posters. You'd have to be a real fool to stay there. Right, Walter said. What about the paper? Oh yeah, I figured giving Carla my location was a good insurance to make sure I made it back. But that was before I knew about the new surveillance. I found somewhere to hide and just hoped one of you would be by soon. Well, that was a stupid idea, Walter sighed. Worked, didn't it? Only because I haven't already left for New York, Walter grunted. Well, what about Carla? Dave asked, gesturing to her. Hey, don't look at me. Someone has to run this place. I can't go off looking for every one of my clients, she said, handing Walter a glass. Listen, if we're going to have any hope of freedom, we need to act rationally. You can't go running your mouth in public, and you can't go hoping someone will save you. We all have to work slow and bide our time. But that's just it, Dave growled, slamming his fist on the counter. We can't keep waiting while the government puts up more surveillance and gains more ground. We should act now when we have the chance. The elevator doors opened, and a group of men stepped into the speakeasy. They were dressed head to toe in black, and any facial features were obscured by shades or masks. One man stepped forward. His dark leather boots clacked against the cedar floor. Ready, Walt? The man asked, his voice distorted by a device attached to his mask. Walter turned away from Dave to face him. You're early, he said, taking one last gulp of his drink before standing. Ran into some trouble, the man said. What kind of trouble? Walter asked, looking concerned. Don't you worry about a thing. Grab your stuff, he said. Walter turned to Dave. Our people are scattered, their spirits crushed. We don't have an advantage. We need to regroup, Walter said as he buttoned his dark coat. Dave made a move to interject, but Walter stopped him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You want to do something? Come to the city with me. We can always find a use for you there. Dave looked at Carla, who only shrugged. He then looked back to Walter, who was now pulling his own mask on. What will it be, kid? He asked. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the muffled breathing of the masked men opposed the silence. A quartet of plastic-faced figures staring at Dave with soulless eyes. Dave was quiet for a moment, weighing his options. He then looked to Walter. He was now holding another mask out to him. The pale finish shone softly in the muted lights. Fine, I'll do it. He took the mask from Walter and pulled it over his face. He gave one last glance to Carla. She smiled and waved as they started out. I know a woman in Albany, Harper Verne. She co-owns another speakeasy. You should check it out, she said. The two nodded and joined the group in the elevator. Walter punched in the combination to the ground floor, and the iron doors clasped shut.